Hey guys, this week's class will be coming from Genesis chapters 29, 30, and 31. In these chapters, we are going to be looking at the character development of Jacob and how he is being established as a standalone, um, I guess, benefactor of God's blessings. And then we'll be looking at how God establishes his blessings through Jacob as Jacob gets his wives, his children, his property, and how he's making his way back to the promised land. We know that prior to these chapters, Jacob has had conflict with his brother Esau. He has stolen Esau's blessing, and his mom and dad have encouraged him to go back to his uncle Laban's family in order to find a wife there and I guess live there. So for this week's lesson, it's going to be imperative that you remember last week's lesson where I believe was regarding Jacob and Esau, and that was Genesis 27 through 28. At the end of Genesis 28, this is verses 10 through 22, we see Jacob's dream where God comes to him and establishes his covenant made through Abraham, and he imparts this covenant upon Jacob, and he promises him, what would be success, and that everything would go well with him just because he had God's blessing. So we know that as Jacob is leaving his comfort and his life of wealth, because he comes from generational wealth, we know that he is going to be tried. We can expect him to be tried. But we know as readers of these next chapters that no matter what he goes through, he will be successful because Genesis 28, verse 10 through 22 says that God will be with him. So it's very imperative that we remember that. Now, this week's passage, like I said before, we will be looking at Jacob's marriages, his children, and it's imperative that you remember to look out for the descendants that will be coming from Genesis, and these descendants will be the ones that will later form the nation of Israel hundreds of years later. And from this week's study, you should be able to trace some important genealogies that lead up to Jesus Christ. And I want you to be able to begin realizing realizing the fulfillment of God's promises and promises in the covenant that he made to Abraham. So you should be able to trace and see, oh, here's one thing that God promised that he has done through these chapters. And I would encourage you that if you haven't, it would be wonderful if you can read the whole book of Genesis in just one setting in order to get the whole picture. And then for this week's class, I also want you to pay attention to the character development of Jacob. I think it's very, very important. And this is before he is renamed Israel. And I want you to be able to see the differences between Jacob's character compared to what you've read about him before in the previous chapters. And are you able to see similarities between the faith walk of Jacob and his forefathers, especially Abraham? And I think it's very clear in there. Now, in Genesis 29, we see that Jacob will get cheated. We see Jacob return to the east to the people of his mother Rebekah as per his father Isaac's instructions, and we see that in Genesis 28, verse 1 through 5. And we know that Laban is Rebekah's brother, so that means Laban is Jacob's uncle. And in chapter 29, we know that Jacob will only be allowed to stay with Laban on condition that he becomes hired help. And we know that Jacob is the son of a man of tremendous wealth. We know that his grandfather Abraham was also a very wealthy man, but at this point, we can assume that he doesn't have a lot of things. But him coming from generational wealth and being a son of man that had a lot of money and stuff, at this point, we know that Jacob is going to take on the role of a servant and establish himself from scratch. And we know that in verse 29, Jacob will be a servant for his uncle Laban, and that's the only condition that he's allowed to stay in Laban's household. And in chapter 29, you should be able to see the differences between the characters of Jacob and Laban. They are two conflicting characters. We know that in this chapter, we can tell that Jacob is, in as much as he may have stolen a blessing before, Jacob is not a lazy man, and we see him accepting the humble role of a servant, even if that means him working to get his wife Rachel, who's been promised to him. And we know that studying Genesis 29, we know that when he's working for those 7 years, that's bride price, that is dowry. Many cultures have that. If possible, it would be nice if you were able as a teacher to look into some of the differences between the Near Eastern traditions of marriage and maybe do comparisons with our own traditions now. It seems a bit out of whack, but the things that they were doing and their customs made a lot of sense. And so like the 7 years as a bride price made sense at the time. And I think there's some really, really cool things that we can learn that if I had the time, I could even compare like some of the customs that we see in Genesis 29 with like perhaps the story of the 10 virgins that Jesus later talks about. There's some similarities in there. But we see that at the beginning, Jacob is promised Rachel, and in the end, he is given somebody else. He's given her sister Leah, and we know that this is a big conundrum, and we can tell that even the way the story is set up, the Bible in Genesis 29 verses 15 through 17, it begins by showing this comparison between the sisters, Rachel and Leah. We see that the Bible talks about how different they were in their beauty. And we can tell that there's this competitive nature in their relationship, and we can tell that there might be conflict in Laban's family. But we can use this to make a correlation between Leah and Rachel with their relationship with that. We can compare their relationship with that of Jacob and Esau. So Jacob is pretty much going back into the same situation he just came from. I think that's a very cool thing to think about. But we also know that this is not the only time that Jacob will be caught in family conflict. We see later on, looking at the story of Joseph, we'll see that Joseph's brothers don't like him because there's again that sibling competition between them, kind of like I believe Bergen should have talked about in last week's lesson. But in the end, Jacob is cheated and he gets the wife that he did not ask for. And we know that Laban is a very shrewd, deceptive man of questionable character. And in the notes that I gave you, it would be nice if you looked at Genesis chapter 24 verses 29 and then Genesis 31 verses 27. You could see that Laban's character is kind of, he's not the best person, but he cheats Jacob, an innocent man. I guess you can argue for that and say, well, Jacob had stolen the blessing before, but you and your class can discuss that. But I think it's very interesting that in the story in chapter 29, Jacob, who deceptively stole a blessing from his brother, will in this story now become the deceived. So it's kind of like the tables have turned, and it's very, very interesting. But we know that all of this is still like a very, very great opportunity that God is using to change and improve, you might say, the character of Jacob. I have questions that I haven't answered for you that maybe you can discuss in your class, especially regarding this specific story, the deception. How did that happen? Was Leah in cahoots with her father? Did she know what was happening? Why did Rachel let this happen? How did Jacob not realize that he had the wrong wife on the night of his wedding? And I think these are very, very cool things to maybe discuss with your class, and maybe things you can look into yourself before the class. But we know for a fact that in the story, Jacob is almost reaping what he sowed, and I think it's very, very interesting. And one of the questions that I have in the notes I said was Jacob being a hypocrite since he had cheated his own brother out of a blessing. And then I talked about was God teaching Jacob a lesson? And I left some questions in there that maybe you guys can discuss. But main thing that I would love for you guys to maybe, if possible, one of the things that I want you guys to focus on is how is Jacob's character in chapter 29 different from the Jacob that we know from the previous chapters. And you can see some pretty cool things. In Genesis 30, we see the establishment of Jacob's lineage, and I mean the lineage that goes all the way to Abraham. Abraham had one son, Isaac. Isaac had two kids, Jacob and Esau. Esau went off to do his own thing, and then we're now following the blessing to Abraham through Jacob. And now we're going to see how Jacob has two wives, right? And I try not to get into the topics of polygamy and all of that, but I think it's interesting how God is using both Leah and Rachel to establish Jacob. And one of the notes that I left in there is that I think it's interesting because the Bible describes Leah as being dull in the eyes, is not as pretty as Rachel, and it seems Jacob, it doesn't seem, it's clear that Rachel was the favored wife, but Christ was born under Leah because Judah was Leah's fourth son, and so God favors the downtrodden. And it's kind of similar even to Jacob, because Jacob growing up was not the favored child, because Isaac loved Esau better, but God used Jacob. So there's like all these ties that you can make, but you guys can look through this the chapter, and maybe you can even find some more things that maybe I haven't seen. But genealogies are very important in the Bible, and it would be kind of cool for your class to see how each of the children is born, you know, beginning with Reuben, and then the other ones after that. But I also think chapter 30 has very cool correlations between, I can make correlations between Jacob's dealings with his two wives and their two concubines, so 4 women, and the relationship between Abraham and Sarah, because in both stories have this issue of barrenness, I guess particularly for Rachel and Sarah. And then Rachel, just like Sarah, give their husbands a concubine so they can have children through them, right? And that comes with its own conflict within the families themselves. And maybe that's stuff that you guys can look through and see what God might be teaching you through that. And I have to apologize, these chapters have a lot of information, and I'm struggling to find a way to condense all these wonderful, cool things into just a few lessons. And so I want to apologize about that. But can you see, again, like I talked about before, from chapter 30, can you see the establishment of God's blessings upon Jacob? We know that even up to now, children are a blessing from God. And so God is establishing the nations through Jacob and his 2 wives and their concubines, but it's not without its own conflict. And it seems like conflict in the family has always followed these great men in the Bible, even from Abraham. And then towards the end of chapter 30, you'll see Jacob's prosperity, and maybe your class can dwell on that a little bit and ask yourselves, well, how was Jacob being successful? Was he successful because he had learned to be a strong businessman, or was it because of God's blessings upon him? And I would argue and say men are successful not because they are smart. Men are successful because God is upon them. And then verse 31, we will be looking at the story of Jacob fleeing from Laban, and I'm using the ESV, Jacob fleeing from Laban, right? And I think, again, those comparisons between the characters of Laban and Jacob will come very abundant. But also in chapter 31, you should be able to see the character of Jacob. He seems more honest. He seems more, he seems very different from the Jacob that we read about before. I believe it was, I think it might have been like chapter 27 that was describing Jacob and Esau, and Esau was described as this, fearsome guy that was out in the wilderness, hunting animals, and Jacob was described as this almost like soft guy, the man who dwelt in the tent, the Bible says. And so he was used to a soft life, but in this story, more than 14 years later, there's almost like this roughness about Jacob that makes him look different. But it's not just even like the outward appearance, but it's also like the inward character of Jacob. And you can look at Jacob's conversation with his wives. I think that's at the beginning of chapter 31, when he's talking to Rachel and Leah, how he attributes his success to God and God's promises. And he keeps saying, this is where all my success is coming from. And I love that. But then also later down there, you can look at Jacob's conversation with Laban, and you can see Jacob striking a contrast between himself and his father-in-law, and I guess his brothers-in-law that have accused him of stealing. But we know that at this point, Jacob is a successful man who is wealthy because of God's favor upon him and not by deceptive means. And so these chapters that we've looked at, we will see how God has worked through the life of Jacob step by step, and you can see almost each and every single good thing that Jacob has and how he came about it. And you cannot leave reading these chapters without looking at how God worked through Jacob's life in like a really, really awesome way. And I think that's very, very interesting. And so as you're reading these scriptures, in conclusion, I want to remind you of the things that I talked about before. Again, there's a lot of stuff it's included in these chapters that I just don't think a 45-minute class will do these chapters justice, but do the best that you can. How can you see the genealogies that are important to the Israelite nation? Can you later on maybe find where each of the 12 sons of Jacob ended at? Can you see the 12 tribes of Israel? Does this remind you of the kingdom? Does it remind you of when the kingdoms were split? The 10 that went north and the 2 that went south. All that is being established right here, and I think it's very, very important. We cannot have the story of Jesus without having this that's happening before us, and I think all of this is very, very important. But also, how is God working through the character of Jacob? And I've said that very, 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 very many times, but we can look at how God has worked through Jacob, and we can use that to look at our own lives and think, how has God worked through me? Where has God taken me? And a lot of us, our lives look very similar to Jacob, where God is putting us in situations where he blesses us. We're successful because of God's blessing, but he does not deny us hard work. He does not take us away from hard work and strife. And a cool thing, I guess, that we could use this week that's similar to last week's lesson, maybe look at the family conflict in Jacob's family and that of Laban, because we can see conflict in there, and maybe ask yourselves questions. How can we better deal with stuff like that in our own families? All right, I hope that's helpful enough. Too much information to go over in just a 20-minute video, but I hope you guys enjoy this wonderful passages with your class this weekend. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. God bless you. Bye-bye.